Part 5 Chapter 21 Training Wheels. The news of Izuku's plan to start traveling was taken rather well. The Southsiders didn't make any threats to keep him from leaving, but the younger kids did end up crying on him. Of course, there were some complaints about Izuku not being there to teach them 6 days a week, but those comments dried up pretty quick. Besides, Izuku wasn't going to be leaving until after he had a car and a license, so they would all have time to come to terms with Izuku's departure. The kids decided to cling to him or follow him around, so for the last weeks of August no one bat an eye when Izuku had at least 2 toddlers on each leg like koalas. Thankfully, Izuku had some help to put his plan into action. The Bakugos were surprisingly helpful after Auntie Mitsuchan got over Izuku leaving the nest so soon. He had even learned that before his auntie and uncle had caught on, they lived very transient lives doing work all over Japan. With this experience, they were able to give Izuku a ton of advice for how to survive on the road, from shortcuts to save on time and fuel, to things and signs to look out for so he could avoid nasty surprises. Izuku wrote everything they said down in his travel guide, and tried to memorize as much of it as he could. As his family covered helping with the actual transition from living with his mom to being nomadic, Izuku turned to the Southsiders to help him learn to drive, as he trusted he wouldn't be caught learning to drive there. While it would technically be legal for him to learn, Izuku didn't feel like risking the cop pulling him over was one of the few who knew quirkless laws. This is far from the first time the Southsiders had taught Izuku something in return instead of monetary payment. Much like with Anya-san teaching him some Russian, he knew bits and pieces of other languages, like French, from students willing to try and teach him. So, as he wasn't surprised when a week after he told them he wanted to learn to drive that he slipped behind the driver's side of a car with Zachary in the passenger side. Izuku was sitting in a decent, if very old car Zachary was borrowing from his brother. "Alright, punk, let's start with what each of these doohickeys do, alright? You got 2 pedals down there," the brunette told him, pointing down where Izuku's feet were. "Lefty is your brake. Righty over there is the gas. That shit is damn near universal for all cars. A few might have a third brake for some fucking reason," he explained, then pointed to the 2 levers sticking out of the steering wheel. "Lefty stick is your turn signal. You pull it where you're going to turn. Your right stick over here is for the window wipers." Zachary was very straightforward as he detailed the controls of the car, what was and wasn't common, and all that shit, as he'd put it. Then once Izuku felt mentally prepared enough to start, Zachary helped him learn to adjust the seat properly so he could reach the pedals. Zachary spent a good minute laughing when Izuku needed to sit on a book to see the road over the dashboard. Finally ready to drive, Zachary gave him the keys and he tried to start the car only for it to stall. Izuku frowned and tried it again only for it to not start. He looked to Zachary feeling lost, and saw the brunette snickering. "You've got to put your foot on the brake, punk." He managed to get out and Izuku nodded, a tad embarrassed. Zachary's attitude had done a lot to help ease Izuku's nerves as he drove the heavily cracked up road of the district. He made a few mistakes as expected, but Zachary was always playful about it and brushed most of them off, sometimes with a joke. He also gave Izuku some tips and tricks about driving. The one that stood out the most was, and he quote, "Any speed higher than 32 kilos and you ain't driving anymore, you're fucking steering." It stuck out in Izuku's mind mainly because when he tried to stop the car only for it to not stop quite as he thought it would, considering he'd probably spend a lot of time on highways, it was a good rule of thumb to keep in mind. By the end of Izuku's first lesson, he didn't think he screwed too much up, but he certainly had to work on his nerves before getting on the open road, and upon getting out saw he needed to work on his parking as well. Izuku had somehow managed to get the car's rear end on the sidewalk and outside the lines of the space. Zachary let out a low whistle as he propped his arm on Izuku's shoulder. "Damn Deku sensei. Good thing you're book smart, right?" he scoffed, giving him a lazy sharp-toothed grin while Izuku was dying inside knowing there was no way the brunette would let him live it down. Zachary rolled his eyes. "Oi, buck up, punk," he said, lightly whacking the back of his head. "More a love tap than a hit. You didn't hit a goddamn fire hydrant. Most of this shit is stuff you just have to get fucking used to," Zachary told him as he pulled out a cigarette. He had been gracious enough to not smoke in the car with him. "So, redo this clusterfuck after class tomorrow?" he inquired as he lit up. "Why yeah, thanks for tea this Zachary-san," Izuku muttered, rubbing his arm, and Zachary scoffed. "This ain't shit, kid, just a couple dipshits fucking around," he replied, elbowing Izuku softly with a wink, before Zachary jumped back in the car and left him to his own devices. Learning to drive with Zachary thankfully mostly went well in the last week of August. He tried not to think about the time he hit a dog since Kiku-kun and Tanaka-san were taking very good care of the dog. Whether or not Zachary had to spend an hour calming Izuku down and reassuring him that he didn't kill it shall remain between the two. And the vet they took the dog to. Dog incident aside, Izuku felt as ready as he could be for his driver's license exam on the first week of September. He made sure to bring everything he'd possibly need to the exam: his Japanese civilian ID, birth certificate, his individual number, a printout of the laws allowing him to apply for a license at 13, 2 pieces of proof of him residing in his prefecture, a book, and about 23,450 yen for any expenses. So, he tried to reassure himself as best he could as he stood in front of a driver's license center in his prefecture. The building wasn't the closest to his house, but it was located in a less than reputable neighborhood. A part of Izuku knew he shouldn't be comforted by that particular fact, but it did, heavily. Actually, entering the building was a bit tense as he wasn't sure what to expect from the people there. Being with the Southsiders for so long had unintentionally taught him to be wary of places like this, mainly from a lot of horror stories of how they had been treated, and he had no idea what might happen to him since he was quirkless. He went over to the front desk to ask an employee for some help. "Excuse me? Miss?" he softly called to one of the people behind the counter. The woman in question turned to and stared at him with a confused look. "Hello, young man. Are you looking for someone? Or waiting on someone?" she asked, her eyes darting around the room looking for something, or someone as the case may be. Izuku turned a bit red. "No, I'd like to get my driver's license. Ichikawa-san," he told her, making out her name tag as his hands went to the strap of his bag. The woman blinked and looked him up and down. "Oh, well, how old are you?" 18 is the minimum age to apply, she questioned, and Izuku opened his bag. "N normally yes. B but according to T this law I can apply N now SS since I'm quirkless," he timidly explained, handing over the printout. Ichikawa took the papers and stared at them blankly. She seemed more confused than anything else. "Could you hold on a second? I need to ask my supervisor about this," she politely requested, and Izuku nodded, glad she hadn't just turned him away. The woman walked off to talk to some man before both disappeared from sight. Maybe Izuku should have let his mom come with him, because standing by himself in a building full of people he didn't know that weren't Southsiders was making him suddenly feel paranoid, his eyes darting to any movement in his range of sight. Izuku was probably about to start picking at his nails when the woman returned. "Sorry for the delay. You should be able to apply today if you brought all the necessary documents," Ichikawa said, handing back the papers. Izuku was half surprised she wasn't back to tell him to leave. "If you just follow me, I'll take you to where you can take the written exam," she told him. Izuku nodded and kept pace behind her. Ichikawa brought him to a room with other people and computers. Izuku was passed off to another staff member and he began the written exam after handing over his identification documents. He could have done the test on a computer, but he felt more comfortable with a paper test he could hold in his hands. His mom had given him an updated copy of the Japanese traffic laws and he had read it religiously for the past 2 weeks. The test felt like it was 100 pages with thousands of questions, but glancing at the clock after he finished told him it was only 10 minutes since he started. Izuku handed it in and nervously watched as the officer marked his answers. He tried not to do anything but grip his bag's strap and tried not to fidget too much. He nearly collapsed out of relief when the test came back 100% correct. He was then escorted to where the practicals were held and got assigned a ride along. Getting in the car was a bit nerve-wracking, but thankfully he was in a car small enough he didn't need to sit on the book he brought. Izuku was immensely grateful that whatever deity that made its life duty to screw with him took a break and left him alone for his practical test. Izuku's legs were basically jelly after he finished the test, but he got out of the car and he walked it off. He didn't want to give anyone any reason to believe he shouldn't have a license. He was already at a disadvantage being so young and quirkless. The ride-along instructor wasn't the most expressive, but he didn't clock any negative reactions. Izuku nervously trailed after his ride-along back into the building and sat where the man told him to. He was tempted to read his book, but he didn't want to miss whenever someone would come to get him. He tried to not let his hopes get too high as he waited. It would be his just luck to go through the whole thing and only be told after everything that they wouldn't give him a license. His hands returning to the strap of his bag, and Izuku should probably look into getting more straps to replace this one given the wear he'd done to it. Someone cleared their throat, making him jump, while he was lost in thought about whether he could buy them or if he'd have to make new ones. Ichikawa was now standing in front of him. "Congratulations, sir. You've passed both the written test and the practical. We just need to confirm some details," she informed him. Izuku beamed and nodded happily, trailing after her. Chapter 22. Leaving the nest. Izuku was grinning when he walked out of the driving license center with a paper copy of his license in hand. The biggest challenge of his plan had been taken care of, and all he needed now was to pick out a car with his mom. He pulled out his phone and took a picture of the paper and sent it to his mom and the Bakugos. He immediately rushed home to have a small celebration with the three and helped his mom make a cake roll. Part of him felt torn up that Kachan couldn't be a part of this, and that when things like this were happening that Kachan was left home alone. So he snuck some of Kachan's favorite spicy candies in the leftovers the Bakugos took, along with a little note praising him for the progress he's made in therapy. He prepared all the things he got for his life on the road that night and was prepared to go as soon as he had the car. The next day after he finished teaching, he made sure to publicly thank the Southsiders for helping him get his license. Zachary jokingly complimented Izuku for not hitting a fire hydrant during his test. Once done with his work, he and his mom went to visit some dealerships to find a car. Izuku had come up with a list of things he would need out of a vehicle. A vehicle that could handle going off-road for the backcountry roads that he'd likely take. A decent-sized backseat to sleep on if he needed to. Fuel efficient to get the most out of his mileage. Insulation for the colder months. Optional. A cheaper model car would be optimal so that repairs, replacement parts would hopefully not be a big hit to their wallet. It was fairly difficult to find a good car in a dealership that would accept selling a car to a 13-year-old even though they had the necessary documents and cash on hand to pay for one. Thankfully, they did manage to get a decent car at the third dealership that checked most of his boxes. That night was when it really sunk in for the two greenettes as he packed his car with his things. As Izuku put the last bag of his in the car, it felt a bit final in some way. Tomorrow he was going to be leaving and they likely wouldn't see other in person for a few days. So Izuku decided to get out some blankets and pillows to have a mini pillow fort and slept in the living room with his mom watching some old pre-quirk movies until bed. It was probably a bit childish, but he wanted to spend some time bonding with his mom before he left, even if he wasn't leaving permanently. That morning was one full of anxious excitement as the two had breakfast for the last time. Izuku probably spent just a bit too long hugging his mom and crying with her before he took to the open road. He had plans to be in Hiroshima Prefecture in time to visit some of the red light districts there. The anxious excitement he had skyrocketed during the first hour of the drive, but it was soothed as he fell into the rhythm of the traffic flow. He was even able to enjoy some of the country he had never seen before since he hadn't left Shizuoka outside of his work in the south side. Unlike when he first went to Niigata, he could feel the giddy excitement of exploring more of the world outside of his neighborhood. Izuku was kind of thankful for Uncle Masan had given him a dashcam to record the drive so he could focus on the road instead of the amazing scenery. He took a break about halfway at a little gas shop to stretch his legs and grab a bite to eat. He took some photos and texted with his mom as he did, to keep her updated on his journey as he promised her. Getting back on the road was easier for him as he now knew what to expect. He also started to listen to podcasts related to his classes since he felt he could listen to them and not accidentally crash the car now. There were one or two incidents where he tried to turn too soon or enter a lane a bit too quickly before he finally got to the city and the hotel where he reserved a room. It was about 11 a.m. when he got there, and Izuku was glad he listened to Auntie about booking places with 24-hour check-ins. He was able to check in right away after confirming everything was in his name. He had to wait for an hour to get everything sorted that yes, he was old enough to travel on his own. He settled down in his room, then had a video call with his mom to tell her he arrived safely and took advantage of the free Wi-Fi to do his coursework in the room. He had admittedly fallen behind on his college classes because he had been too caught up in building the apartment complex and the funeral, so he gave himself 5 hours to catch up on that every day and he relaxed falling into his courses. Izuku made sure to set an alarm though, so he didn't spend more than the 5 hours doing his courses by getting caught up in an info binge. So when 4 p.m. came up, he exited out of the tab of mutation quirk subcategories and got ready to visit the red light districts. He had some idea of what to expect from the area, but he didn't know if his goodwill in the south side had traveled this far. Izuku made sure to lock up his room with the "Do Not Disturb" sign on the door before he took his car to visit the first of 5 districts. He was pleasantly surprised by the better condition of the 5 districts there. Well, they were still the slums of the area, but there weren't any destroyed buildings like in the south side. He wasn't surprised or shocked that the people there didn't really know him and didn't take the suspicion in their eyes with much hurt. While there were homeless people that migrated, Izuku doubted the ones he knew traveled this far from the south side. He took their distrust in stride, as they would likely get used to him as the Southsiders had. In each district, Izuku wasn't just visiting but actively searching for somewhere he could have his lessons. He found a few places that should have been fine, and in the last one he visited he went to a homeless shelter with some blankets and quilts. His bribery of cloth bought him enough goodwill with the supervisor to let him help the younger residents learn math and spelling. After he was done at the shelter, he felt like treating himself and picked up some takeout for dinner before he returned to his hotel. He was a lot more successful than he thought he would be for his first day in the area, and he had another video call with his mom to have dinner with her even if they were over 300 miles away from each other. He was tired but felt incredibly satisfied with what he had managed to do and that he was going to do something to help others. Perhaps this fulfilling feeling won't last, and maybe the burnout from how much he will be traveling will strike him down eventually. But as he laid down to sleep for the night after triple-checking his locks, Izuku seriously doubted he'd regret his decision. Chapter 23. Meeting someone just like me. Waking the next morning, Izuku had gotten ready for the day before checking out and headed to a small 24-hour American-style diner. He connected to the cafe's Wi-Fi and started a video call with his mom. He had to wait for a few moments before he and Mom connected. He beamed upon seeing his mom. "Good morning, Mom." He cheerfully greeted. "Hello, Izuku. How are you doing? Did you leave the hotel already?" Inko responded, likely noticing the booth he was sitting in instead of the nice little room he had booked. "Yeah. I'm about to have breakfast, then I'll be heading to Kumamoto." Izuku answered before briefly telling a waiter what he wanted. "How are you doing? Did you sleep all right last night?" he inquired, turning his attention back to his mom. "Yes, I did." "Did you, honey? I know you have trouble adjusting," she questioned, settling down at the kitchen to eat her own breakfast. "Yup. Had kind of a weird dream about Wash taking me to see Atlantis in one of his soap bubbles. I think I was pretty worn out from yesterday's excitement," Izuku replied, rubbing the back of his neck. The two happily went on to talk about the various mermaid versions of heroes he saw in his dream as they ate breakfast together. Inko told him she was thinking of taking some time off and maybe going out on a girls' day trip with Auntie Mitsuchan. Izuku tried to encourage her to do it and even go to a spa, since he couldn't remember the last time his mom took some time to take care of herself. Inko gave a quick goodbye after about half an hour as she had to get to her job, and Izuku promised to call again if he could during her lunch break. Izuku finished up his breakfast, then left to get to the next prefecture. Kumamoto was quite a bit further, and he wanted to be there with enough time to relax for an hour at least before throwing himself into the districts. He took a break about 3 hours into again stretch his legs and have a bathroom break, but before he got back on the road, he texted with Uncle Masan and got him to help convince Andy to take his mom out for some fun. Izuku was tempted to ask how Kachan was doing, but ultimately decided against it since it was a can of worms. He wasn't sure he could deal with it and do his work. Izuku greatly enjoyed crossing the Kanman Bridge, and the view was simply amazing. Then he made a mental note to find some time to come back to take some pictures here. He decided against going to the hotel he booked right away this time and looked for an internet cafe. Izuku found a nice little place by the Shirakawa River and ordered something to snack on while he started his college courses. When it was his mom's lunch break, he called her up and talked with her as he did his work. He took a moment to show her the river as well and promised to grab a souvenir for her. When he was done with his classes, and he had a very satisfying info binge on how quirks had evolved from environments people were born in as well as parental factors. He paid for his time and the food he ate before moving on to visit the districts like he had planned. Given the people in Hiroshima were only vaguely aware of him, he didn't expect much of a welcome, and Izuku was mostly right. A good majority had no clue about him or his work, and he was definitely considered an outsider. Izuku was looking around the last red light district for a place to teach when he ran into a member of the local chapter of the Russian Vipers. The brunette was quick to snap at him. "EY. Watch where the fuck you're going, Shathia. But he suddenly cut himself off when he looked down to find the pack of cigarettes he dropped. He blinked and his eyes got wide. "You at two toes?" he asked, suddenly taking Izuku off guard. Izuku blinked, also shocked. He had heard the term thrown around a lot online in the one or two quirkless support groups he was in way back before his mom found out. He hadn't really participated in the groups as he was far too focused on taking care of himself after what happened at school. He did try to message there once in a while originally, but he just lost interest trying to find some time to keep up with the group years ago. But he had never met anyone that knew about the name Two Toes outside of those groups though, so he was a bit less hesitant to answer him. "Why yes?" unsure whether or not he should be scared of the man turning on him. However, the man surprised him by suddenly laughing and apologizing. "Fuck. Sorry, I didn't mean to be a bitch. Especially not to a two toes. Got a little two toes myself, you know." Izuku almost gasped. Really?" he exclaimed. "Yeah. Fuck, it was a pain in the ass to find the kid's shoes. I'd know those damn shoes anywhere." The man joked, running a hand through his hair. "See, could I meet them?" Izuku requested. He hadn't ever met anyone quirkless close to his age. The last time he could ever remember meeting anyone quirkless in person was one time when he was really young. He had met an elderly lady on a train with his mom. Well, Izuku didn't think he had, but it was hard to tell quirkless people from quirked outside of the bright red primordial shoes, and not everyone had shoes in red light districts. Or wanted to be known as quirkless. He to ask some of his students about that the next time he was in the south side. Sure. Probably be good for the squirt to meet another two toes his age. The man responded as he picked up the box of cigarettes, and Izuku was shocked that the man agreed so easily. Really? Jay, just like that? You don't even know me." Izuku replied out of disbelief, and the man scoffed. "You haven't been around many two toes, have you?" he asked, and Izuku nodded. There were offers to meet up in person from the group chats, but he didn't go to any. He didn't want his mom to waste the time or money to bring him to one. Well, if you did, you'd know that two toes like you stick together like a pack of rabid dogs. So even if you're a devious little bag of shit, I know you won't be a fuckhead to the kid." The man told him to brush the whole thing off. Izuku wanted to question how many quirkless people the man had met, but pushed it aside as he quickly followed the man to an apartment building across from a vandalized park. "Stay here, I'll get the little bastard," the man said, and left Izuku standing in front of the building. He checked the time and he still had like an hour before he needed to start teaching, so he'd be able to talk to the kid for a few minutes. Looking back at the park, he could see there was a good-sized clearing by a veranda. The veranda was also in good shape, but he'd need to check it for any gang claims or drugs inside of it. Upon hearing the door to the building open, he turned and saw the brunette man had returned with a little boy about 10 following behind him. Izuku's eyes went straight to the boy's shoes and saw that while they weren't as vivid as his own, he was wearing primordial shoes. Nervous excitement was clear in the other boy, but he was holding back from running up to him. Hello." Izuku warmly greeted, waving to him. The boy practically lit up when he did, but didn't move any closer. The man scoffed, giving the kid a soft push. "Well, go on. You've met other two toes before, and he ain't gonna bite your damn head off," he gruffly encouraged, bemused as he watched the boy run over to him. Hi. I'm Osamu," the boy told him, and Izuku was reminded of the kids back at the south side. "It's nice to meet you, Osamu-san. I'm Midoriya, but you can just call me Deku Sensei." Izuku introduced himself, much to the boy's confusion. "But aren't you too young to be a teacher?" Osamu questioned, head tilted, and Izuku rubbed the back of his head. "Why yeah, but I'm tutoring a lot of people, so that's become my nickname," he explained, choosing to leave out the reason he came up with it was so gangs wouldn't go around spreading his name in the underground. "You must be really smart then, Deku Sensei," Osamu replied, making Izuku flustered. Well, I guess. I mean, I think I'm doing all right in college," he muttered, and Osamu gasped. "You're in C college?" the boy exclaimed, in absolute awe of the fact. Izuku couldn't help being embarrassed as the boy seemed to have stars in his eyes as he looked up at Izuku. "You yeah? I'm working on getting a Q quirk theory degree, but I'm in an online college. They don't have an age requirement for it," he told him, but the hadn't left the boy. "See, can you go to medical school online?" Osamu asked, and Izuku blinked. I don't know. You can probably do some of it on online, but medicine usually involves a lot of direct interaction with people. And doctors and nurses can't learn about how to do surgery or insert a needle properly without practicing it for real. Izuku tried to explain the best he could since he didn't actually know about any of that. Osamu became a little sadder. Why yeah, that makes sense. He muttered, eyes falling to his feet. Do you want to get into medicine, Osamu-san? He inquired, trying to meet the boy's eyes. The boy became bashful and just nodded. Izuku suddenly understood the boy's shyness of the topic. Most medical schools in Japan didn't take quirkless students whether they were open about the rule or not. If Osamu really wanted to go into medicine, it would be quite difficult, but Izuku did have one idea. Have you considered being an EMT? You know the people in the ambulance? He inquired, and the boy shook his head. I think you can become an EMTI if you finish EMTC classes and get certified. He suggested. Becoming a paramedic was one of the things his mom had suggested before if his dreams of being a hero fell through. Osamu's eyes got wide. Really? He whispered, hope clear in his eyes. Why yeah, I'm pretty sure. Izuku confirmed, nodding his head. His mom had double-checked it when he started college. Osamu began grinning and launched himself into hugging Izuku tightly. It was only through experience from the young Southsiders that kept the flailing greenet on his feet as the boy began loudly thanking him. Osamu's father, meanwhile, happily watched Izuku's suffering from his spot 10 feet away as he lit up a cigarette with a very self-satisfied smirk on his lips. Chapter 24. Man, Myth, or Legend. Once Izuku had managed to calm Osamu down, he asked the boy if knew anyone that would like help learning anything. The boy said he would get his friends and ran back into the building. He waited a few minutes before Osamu and a small group of 6 his age followed him out of the building. Izuku introduced himself as Deku Sensei and led the group to the veranda, then went on to help them with their math, science, and spelling. He enjoyed teaching them, and Izuku probably loved teaching kids the most because they always had questions. When the 4 hours of teaching were done, Izuku promised to be back to help Osamu with finding someplace to get his EMT training sometime next week. Izuku began packing up his stuff once the group had left to return to their respective apartments. He was about to leave but noticed that Osamu's father was leaning against the veranda, still clearly waiting for him. Oh, do you need something still? Izuku paused, realizing that he never got Osamu's last name or the man's name either. Just call me Zuki kid. The man interjected, tossing the butt of his cigarette on the ground and crushing it under his foot. Then he walked over to him. Listen, I don't have much other than the bastard, he commented, rubbing the back of his neck. Seeing him like that ain't exactly something that happens every day either, so let me give you some advice. Zuki said, then stared down at him with a very dark look. If you know what's good for you, you'll stay the hell out of Yokohama. Zuki sternly told him. What? Izuku stuttered back, shocked at the man's sudden turn. Zuki rolled his eyes. You may be sheltered for a 2 toes, but I'm sure you know there are places that 2 toes like you just can't go, right? He responded, and Izuku nodded, remaining silent. He knew some places banned quirkless people whether they were open about it or not. He had even been chased out of a shop once when he was 6 and didn't know better. Well, unless you want to disappear off the face of the earth without any trace that you ever existed, you stay the fuck out of Yokohama. Zuki warned, pointing a finger menacingly at Izuku, making him audibly gulp. You'll learn sooner or later that there's a reason 2 toes like you should just keep moving. He added ominously. What do you mean? Izuku asked, voice trembling, and Zuki scoffed. You're no dumbass, brat. Haven't you heard of the story of he who takes? He questioned, and Izuku highly believed that it was rhetorical since he seriously doubted that anyone in this day and age didn't know of that story. He who takes was a quirk-era boogeyman, and there were probably many similar stories in different countries. It was only natural that with the rise of quirks that scary stories of someone who could take them would pop up eventually. Izuku could even remember being thrown jabs about he who takes being the reason he was quirkless when he was younger. Well, old wives' tales like that always have a speck of truth to them, and let's just say that 2 toes that are around he who takes have always had a way of disappearing. You understand what I'm saying? Zuki asked. I think so. Izuku muttered back and the brunette nodded to himself, good. 'Cause if you break the bastard's heart by being stupid and sticking your nose where it doesn't belong, I'll find some way to bring you back and kill you myself, two toes or not. The man threatened, glaring down at Izuku before he went to the apartment building. Izuku, feeling rather confused and nervous by the surprise confrontation, scurried back to his hotel to finally check in, but even after he had dinner and a talk with his mom, Zuki's words stuck out in his mind. His travel plans didn't include going to Yokohama this time around, but after what he'd said, Izuku might never go there. He wasn't sure if he believed that he who takes was the reason behind all the disappearances of quirkless people, but he could easily believe that Yokohama could be more dangerous for a quirkless person than other places in Japan. However, Izuku did pause to consider the idea of someone having a quirk that could take another person's quirk. He had seen people occasionally discuss the topic, but it was always quickly dismissed before any real discussion of the possibility could be held. They gave a lot of reasons, but each of them sounded more like excuses to him. Because Izuku thought the ability to take quirks would be very possible, there were plenty of quirks that could bend or break the laws of reality, and there were quirks that could copy other quirks or affect another person's quirk, so he didn't understand why so many people were adamant it was impossible. He considered that it might have to be something to do with him being quirkless. Izuku was well aware that the scariest thing of he who takes was that he could take your quirk, but that clearly was an empty threat for someone quirkless like him. Sure, Izuku knew that the person could have any number of terrifying quirks, but the man's greatest threat was in a way disconnected from him. With that in mind, he didn't understand why he who takes would want with someone quirkless, because what would there be to gain from someone quirkless? Izuku supposed it would only make sense if you took the smaller subset of stories that spin he who takes being able to give and take quirks instead of just taking them. Said variant was a bit harder for Izuku to believe, but still in the realm of possibility. But that wouldn't explain why the quirkless just disappeared if they got quirks by making deals with the devil, and why would quirkless people be told to avoid him? Maybe he who takes just kills them, but why? What would anyone gain from killing a bunch of quirkless people, because wouldn't that just be a waste of time? Full of questions about the old story, he decided to look into it online because it wouldn't hurt to be a bit more informed about it. Of course, there were a few places that briefly spoke about the story or the nursery rhymes of he who takes, but actually finding where the story came from was proving to be very difficult. Izuku was admittedly frustrated when he found a fourth paper about how the story could have started and nothing about how it did. Not even something benign like confusion over a quirk that would have been like Eraserheads. He was about at the end of his rope, so he did something he normally wouldn't. He turned back to the fifth page of his search engine and clicked on the link for the MLA site. He normally refrained from anything to do with the Meta Liberation Army given their views on the quirkless, but they had been around longer than All Might and had some pretty powerful quirk favoring ideals, so they might have some narrative on he who takes that the mainstream media didn't. And holy hell, did he hit the motherlode of knowledge. The MLA had a much different view of he who takes and even gave him a name where most stories didn't, brother, all for one. Apparently, it was in reference to a pre-quirk story of the Three Musketeers whose motto was all for one, and one for all. The site spoke of he who takes as if he was a real person who was born back during the dawn of the quirk era, and it even went as far as to have accredited him as a founder of the original MLA that had started the Mutant Rebellion, which kickstarted the first of the three quirk wars. It also leaned heavily into the dealer side of the he who takes stories and regaled Izuku about how he offered people a new chance at life by taking, giving, or swapping quirks. Almost instinctively, all of what he had previously been taught made Izuku want to say it was all BS made up by some crackpot in the MLA, but the way it was written gave him pause, as a lot of the arguments to be made could easily be solved by the man's supposed quirk. If such an influential man existed, why wasn't there any record of him? Well, as they say, history is written by the victor, who would have been he who takes, and the only people who would have been around to contest were long past dead, as the few immortals that had lived at the beginning of the quirk era were dead from a quirk loophole in their immortality or infants. Why wouldn't he who takes take credit for all the work he did to free his fellow mutants, as quirked people were called back then? Well, that's only assuming the man was wholly a good person, and history was sadly chock full of horrid people who took advantage of war and disasters to do awful things. If such a quirk existed, then it surely would have been recorded somewhere, right? But he who takes could easily pass off someone else's quirk as his own and destroy any records of himself with any number of the quirks that popped up in the 3 centuries between then and now, leaving nothing but old horror stories passed on as cautionary tales for misbehaving kids. If such a man did exist, surely he would be dead by now and not be what Zuki was trying to warn him about. Except the man could steal any quirk in existence, and Asia has only had one semi-immortality quirk on record in the 300 years quirks have existed, when the international average was 3 per continent. Honestly, the more Izuku thought of it, the more and more it made sense and horribly realistic it was to him. Hundreds of thousands of people disappeared or mysteriously died even before quirks existed. Who in the world would notice if someone started killing people for their quirks if there wasn't any way to determine if someone still had a quirk after death? Much less check for such a thing? Why would someone bitter from the world choose to be a part of it anymore when they could live however they want as a myth of man and take any powerful ability in all of existence? Why would a person treated like a horrid rabid creature by the quirkless majority of 3 centuries ago not hold an unspeakable grudge against the quirkless? Feeling like he was losing himself to quickly spiraling thought of terrible things, Izuku all but slammed his laptop closed. He found himself trembling as he got up from his bed to check for a 4th time that night that all of the room's locks were shut tight. Maybe Izuku was being paranoid after a late-night info binge, but as he, and probably many other quirkless people that lived to 10 years old had found, paranoia could be your worst friend at the best of times and your best ally in the worst times. Chapter 25. Truth in Brother's Grim Fairy Tale. Zuki's warning of Yokohama and his brief research of He Who Takes had understandably left an overthinker like Izuku rattled the next morning, and his mom picked up on it when he called during breakfast. "I'm fine, Mom. Just a really bad dream last night," he skittishly told her, which was only a half-truth instead of a full-on lie, since he did have a vivid nightmare of He Who Takes and what he might do to someone quirkless. He told her of the stupid dream, knowing that hiding it would only make him more suspicious. He let her coo and reassure him as best she could from behind a screen. The words, despite his mom's best attempts, rang hollow in his mind when compared to his knowledge of what was and wasn't possible with quirks. Izuku, previously held excitement, had melted to lukewarm anxiety, and he wasn't able to enjoy the ferry ride like he had hoped he could. The existential dread of the possibility of He Who Takes being real hung overhead despite any attempts he made to force it away. Izuku was able to mask his troubling thoughts when he taught children of an orphanage in one of the districts. But in Cauchy's red light districts he had met another quirkless person, a woman in her 50s, that gave him more ominous warnings about more cities he should avoid. She had been generous enough after he gave her some money to mark on a map where he couldn't go before she left to catch a train. Izuku's return to the Shizuoka prefecture the next day was relieving and somber. He happily embraced his mom when he made it home, since she had taken a lighter shift to welcome him in person. Izuku was much more comfortable doing his coursework back in his own home with his mom to talk to as he did, desperately avoiding any mention of the topic of He Who Takes. He talked with her about things he'd need for his next trip to Niigata and Hokkaido, stuff to leave behind that he hadn't needed, and talking about what they should do that Sunday before he left to visit the districts in his local area, and she went to work. Since he was much closer to Niigata and had visited once before, Izuku found himself welcomed in the 5 districts he visited that day, talking with them, and he met a few other quirkless people. They were just passing through, but speaking with them had helped him learn more about places he shouldn't go to for different reasons, people that wouldn't hesitate to oust him as a two-toes at best, places to avoid like the plague, and places where they as quirkless just weren't welcome. Izuku knew of some places from the woman that they didn't know to avoid and quickly shared with them using the map. He had also marked the areas they said to stay away from. He made sure to thank them for their help, but they brushed it off, saying 2 toes just stuck together, as Zuki had said. When he finished the lessons for that day, he contemplated asking around for more information about He Who Takes when his phone dinged. Checking it, he saw a text from Yuri-san and began to type up a reply to him. Yuri-san had been infrequently texting him since they talked over dinner that one time. It usually started out about Yukiko-chan or his daughter Anya-san, and often he found himself drifting off to some kind of tangent about something he was learning. Yuri-san didn't seem to be angry when he went off on a rant, and he even chipped in sometimes. Yuri-san surprisingly knew a lot about how quirks changed over the years. But since Izuku was back in the area, Yuri-san wanted to know if they could meet up for a bit. Izuku could see the time on his phone and he had maybe 2 hours before he had to be home and he texted as such. He was surprised when he got a location that was really close by, but that didn't stop him from heading to where the location was to meet with Yuri-san. Izuku didn't expect a big fancy restaurant like the last time since the location was only just outside the district, but that being said, he also wasn't thinking that he'd be headed to a nightclub either. He almost wanted to text Yuri-san to double check like he did at the restaurant. He searched up the address separately to make sure it was the same place. Unsurprisingly, he was in the right place, and for a moment Izuku questioned not if he could go into a nightclub but if he wanted to. He hadn't heard anything particularly bad them that made them worse than the red light districts. But Izuku was unsure he wanted to be around drunk people as they could be unpredictable and there would likely be an entrance fee. After a moment of thought, he decided to bite the bullet and moved to get in line but was stopped by a man in a suit. "Midoriya?" He asked. "You yes. Do you need something?" Izuku questioned back. A bit unnerved, the man knew his name, Yuri Zadet Teba Venutri. Divage, Paren. The man told him as he grabbed Izuku's arm and dragged him to the front of the line. The only reason Izuku refrained from protesting was that he was 90% sure the man was taking him to Yuri-san. As he expected, they were given some dark looks as they basically cut to the front and the bouncer was giving them both an unimpressed look back of the line. The bouncer gruffly said, and the man sighed. "Atu asobij gost basa. On velel ni prevesti ego, kak tolko on pride suda." The man responded, presumably explaining something. At least that's what Izuku put together from the words he did know. The bouncer groaned, pinching the bridge of his nose, but stepped aside to let them pass. Izuku felt a bit bad for cutting the line, especially since he caught some of what the people were grumbling about them. He couldn't linger on the thought, though, as upon entering the soft music he could hear from outside got much louder and was almost blinded by the flashing lights. Inside the building was kind of what he expected from pre-quirk media. A bar across one wall, mostly dark inside other than colored flashing lights. A second level he couldn't see much of past the railing. A dance floor full of people and music. The club was certainly not anything like any place he had ever been to before. He didn't know what song was currently playing, but he couldn't say he disliked it. A tug on his arm brought his attention back to the man as he began to lead him again. Izuku silently followed the man to a stairwell to the second level. The upper level was a touch calmer, but he still closely trailed behind the man to not get lost because he doubted he could find Yuri-san on his own, even with how distinct Yuri-san looked. Only about a minute after they got to upper level, the man brought him to a table that was more isolated, and Izuku was quite relieved to finally see Yuri-san. Yuri-san gave him a soft smile. "Privet, Midoriya. A rad, situ tai razil vistreditsa so manoj, prisazivajsa." Yuri-san greeted as warmly as a stoic person could as he motioned Izuku to come closer. "I hope Valentine has been good to you, Midoriya." He added, patting the spot next to him. "He's great," Izuku said, assuming Yuri-san meant the man that led him here, Blagadaru. He quickly told Valentine before moving to sit near Yuri-san. Valentine just nodded in turn. "Do you want anything, Midoriya?" Yuri-san inquired, but Izuku shook his head. "And no thanks, Yuri-san, I'm good." He told him. Yuri-san nodded, dismissing Valentine with a wave of the hand. Now, alone with Yuri-san, Izuku admittedly felt himself relax somewhat. "Midoriya?" Yuri-san called, and the greenette didn't need to turn to know the man was concerned, but seeing it did relieve him to some degree. "Has something happened, Midoriya? You seem tense." Yuri-san asked, apparently noticing Izuku's change in demeanor. His shoulders slumped. "Is it that obvious?" He replied, slightly defeated and wondering if his mom also knew he wasn't all there. "No. I simply have a good grasp on body language, but that is hardly the point." "What has been troubling you?" Yuri-san answered. Izuku hesitated as he pondered whether or not he should really confide in the man. Yuri-san was in a morally gray area between acquaintance and friend. It had been nearly a decade since he made a friend, but he was pretty sure they weren't made that fast. Deciding that even if they weren't that close, he had nothing to lose, Izuku turned to Yuri-san. "I met someone in Kumamoto that told me something." He explained, fiddling with his sleeve. "Oh, what did they tell you?" Yuri-san inquired, head tilted, and Izuku rubbed his neck. "Well, he told me that I shouldn't go anywhere near Yokohama, unless I wanted to disappear." Izuku elaborated and Yuri-san's eyes narrowed. Ah, was he threatening you? Yuri-san questioned and Izuku quickly brought his hands up and waved them, and no, no. He was just trying to warn me about something. He corrected and Yuri-san raised an eyebrow a bit. Warn you about what exactly, Midoriya? He prodded. Izuku hesitated again because he thought of what to say. Should I just say it was about he who takes? Would that seem silly to him? Being scared of the possibility that an old fairy tale was real? Would Yuri-san even know about he who takes? Well, he probably does, but probably not by the same name. What was the Russian version of he who takes again? Would I sound like some conspiracy theorist if I told him about MLA's story of All for One? Izuku was ripped from his thoughts by a sudden drop in the room temperature to something that could only be considered frigid. Turning to Yuri-san, he saw frost had built upon not only on the plastic cup Yuri-san held but everywhere his body was physically touching. Yuri-san's face was also the most expressive he's ever seen, and the emotion wasn't a positive one. Midoriya. Where did you hear that name? Yuri-san questioned, his entire body as tense as his voice. Izuku must have been mumbling, but that wasn't his biggest worry because apparently, Yuri-san did know it. He who takes and the threat became even more real since Yuri-san's demeanor became so rigid. Why, you mean a All for One? Izuku asked for clarification and the temperature drop swiftly got worse. Where did you hear that name? Yuri-san coldly repeated and Izuku's gut twisted. I found it online. IW was trying to look into he who takes after I was warned about him. Izuku answered, body shivering from the cold. Yuri-san sharply inhaled, and he ran a hand through his hair, then let out a large thick cloud of condensation. Midoriya, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Yuri-san sternly told him. Izuku swallowed the massive lump in his throat and nodded. Midoriya, I think we both know who I am and what I do, yes? He stated and Izuku reluctantly nodded. The Greenette had tried looking into Yuri-san after their second meeting because someone that rich and powerful had to have some kind of media presence, right? And Izuku did find Yuri-san. He found article upon article of how the Russian government had tried for decades to tie Yuri-san to the biggest Russian mafia organization in recorded history, of countless lawsuits against Yuri-san where he had been acquitted due to a lack of evidence or witnesses being discredited. Hell, he even found a thread on a conspiracy theory board about Yuri-san being a part of the first generation of heroes in Russia was why no one could convict him. Why, yeah. Izuku timidly admitted, briefly wondering if it was a bad thing to be acquainted with the man or if he was a bad person, since Izuku was fairly sure that Yuri-san was absolutely the head of some criminal organization. Well, when someone like me has been around for as long as I have, you learn things most don't. Including when to keep your mouth shut and your nose out of it. He informed him, moving closer to Izuku. I'll tell you everything I know about All for One, but Midoriya, you need to swear to me that not one word of what I say to you will ever leave this table. Yuri-san offered and Izuku's heart dropped to his stomach, not at the ultimatum, but the fact that Yuri-san was taking this seriously meant that there was something for Izuku to actually be afraid of, and his overing wasn't blowing this out of proportion. I swear. Izuku whispered. Yuri-san sighed, condensation again falling from his mouth in a thick cloud, and he reined in the chill he had unintentionally made. As Yuri-san went on to explain just who All for One was, Izuku couldn't say he felt any better by the end of their talk. Then again, who would feel great about learning someone who's been around for nearly 3 centuries with a massive grudge against them solely for being born quirkless, and that he had any number of powerful quirks at his disposal? Oh, and he just so happens to be a criminal mastermind with ties to just about every major criminal organization in Japan. At least he could have this existential crisis in the safety and comfort of his own bed when he got home.